We spent our last 2 times together explaining the meaning of verses 1 to 6. Those verses can easily be and often are misunderstood and misinterpreted. I explained in the message on abuse that the context of submission is God's will and that it's never right to submit to abuse if you have the option not to do so. Last week we talked about women power in a marriage. Woman power in a marriage. We learned that a good woman's behavior cannot change the bad behavior of a bad man. Her good behavior toward a good man, though, can change his behavior toward her and how he treats her. There are some great books that have been written to wives about how to be a good wife to a husband. The best one, I think, is The Proper Care and Feeding of Husbands by Dr. Laura Schlesinger. It's not a Christian book, but it's a fabulous book. I don't know of any great books for husbands. I probably need to try to write one. Not that it'd be great, but there'd be one out there. If you do know of one, please let me know. I'd like to read it. So turn to 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7. After addressing how a wife should live with her husband, Peter tells us there, you husbands in the same way, live with your wives in an understanding way as someone weaker, since she is a woman, and show her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. First thing I want you to see in your outline, number 1, is that a husband is to fulfill his responsibility to his wife. A husband is to fulfill his responsibility to his wife. So what are his responsibilities? This list is not exhaustive, but in this passage he gives us several. The first one is this: he is to serve her. The husband is to serve his wife. Peter begins by saying in 1 Peter 3:7, in the same way, he's connecting what he's saying to husbands to what he said to wives in verses 1 to 6, and to what he said about Jesus in chapter 2. Jesus came into our world, suffered and died for our sin. Why? To serve us. We learned last week about how a wife is to serve her husband. Serving someone is what love is, and it's what love does. James says, faith without works is dead. Well, saying you love somebody without serving them and doing something for them is pretty meaningless. Some mistakenly think that God created women so they could serve men. I hope to blow that notion out of the water tonight. And many think they must be a somebody because there are people who serve them. So in other words, if I have people serving me, I must have arrived. I must be a somebody. Jesus said just the opposite in his kingdom. If you want to be a somebody, you serve other people. You serve others. So Matthew 23:11, he said, the greatest among you shall be your servant. As we saw last week, the husband is to be the head of his home. That means he is to serve the body. In this case, would be his wife and children. So him being the head of the home is not about authority, it's about responsibility and his responsibility to serve his family. So his first responsibility is to serve her. Number 2, he is to understand her. He is to understand her. If you're paying attention, there's quite a big degree of difficulty on this one. 1 Peter 3:7, live with your wives in an understanding way. In an understanding way. God wired men up to respond to challenges. That's how you motivate men. You dare them. You know, the coach gives them the big challenge to do this or do that, and we do that. Well, if you want a challenge, here it is. Understand your wife. There's your challenge. You'll be working on that one till the day you die. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, it says, the Lord God formed man. And then you go down to chapter 2, verse 22, and it says, the Lord God fashioned a woman. Different words. The Hebrew word translated formed here is a real simple word. It's a kind of word that you would have used back in school ages ago when for an art project and a Christmas gift, you would have a child take a lump of dough and turn it into an ashtray. How many of y'all remember that stuff? Back in those days, about everybody smoked. All the parents did. And so you did. It was supposed to be a good gift. You're old if you remember that. So it's just simple. You take a piece of dough, you try to make it look like an ashtray. On the other hand, piece of clay. On the other hand, the word translated fashion is a complicated word. It's a complex word. It's more like building a computer. Very different. So men are simple, women are complex. Men, this is something Dr. Laura says, are real easy to turn. It doesn't take a lot to turn a man back towards you. Women are really hard to turn. They're more complicated. A woman's brain is firing almost all of the time. And it bounces from one thing to another, to another, to another, to another. Am I in the right room? Okay, that's how a woman's brain works. A men's brains experience a lot of downtime. Wives are always asking their husbands, what are you thinking about? And the husbands are forever answering, nothing. And the wives either think they're lying or hiding something, because how could they possibly be thinking about nothing? Well, scientific studies have proven, yes, they do think about just nothing. They're pretty good at it. In fact, someone has suggested that a woman spends more time thinking about what her husband's thinking about than her husband spends thinking. I don't know if that's true or not. And maybe you've heard this, where somebody tells you, if a man tells you he understands his wife, he'll lie to you about other things. Women are complicated. So even though they're complicated, men are simple, the husband is literally to study his wife. That word understanding is a form of the word knowledge. He's to study her, to gain knowledge of her. He's got to learn what she likes and dislikes, what she needs and wants, what she doesn't. He needs to learn what gives her happiness and what might set her off. He studies her. He gets better at understanding her and loving her as the relationship develops if he studies her. A couple more interesting things from Genesis. If you recall, everything that God did was good until he made men, or made Adam by himself. Then he said, this is not good. And then once he made Eve, it says, now things were very good. You remember that? Did you notice that? Someone said what God did once he made the woman, he said, now that's better. So maybe, I don't know. As I said in the message on abuse, the word helper can mean warrior. It's used in the Old Testament of God was Israel's helper, helping them in battle. So helper doesn't mean that you were created just to do for this man whatever he wants you to do for him. It does not mean that at all. And then Eve, it says, was suitable for Adam. The Hebrew word translated suitable could be translated corresponding to or opposite of. And probably both are pretty good translations. The differences between men and women aren't wrong, they're intended. They're intended. The differences are what make the relationship interesting. You've heard the expression, opposites attract. Well, if you don't learn how to get along in marriage, opposites attack, okay? So you've got to learn your spouse. You've got to learn what they like and don't like. So he is to understand her. The third responsibility he has to his wife, he is to protect her. To protect her. 1 Peter 3:7 says, live with your wives as with someone weaker, since she is a woman. Now, the only thing this means is that women are physically weaker than men. It's why transgender boys and men shouldn't be playing in shouldn't be playing in girls and women's sports. Serena Williams, arguably the best female tennis player of all time, said in her prime, if she played one of the top men's players, they would beat her 6-0, 6-0 in likely 10 minutes. And she's the best tennis player, maybe female tennis player ever. A top men's tennis player now, he could play to 37 or 8, drop out, join the women's tour, and probably not lose a match till he was 55. Men are physically stronger. Out in the California fires, I don't know if you caught this, there's some kind of ladder. It normally takes 2 men carry that ladder. But since California's gone woke, they had to have more women in the fire department, and it took 3 women to carry that ladder. So those were some more of the complications of them fighting those fires. They didn't have people who could do what the people in the past used to be able to do. Women, even though they're physically weaker, are often emotionally stronger than men. So for example, you've probably seen this. If a man loses a longtime wife, he won't do as well as a woman who loses a longtime husband. Maybe it's because she's glad to get rid of him, I don't know. But anyway, for whatever reason, older women widows tend to fare better than older widowers. Think about Esther. She sure wasn't weak. I'm going in, and if I die, I die. There are emotionally weak women, just like there are emotionally strong men. In general, though, men are physically stronger, women are emotionally stronger. The husband should protect his wife physically from harm. That's kind of a no-brainer. But he ought to protect her in other ways. He ought to be the guard at the gate, protecting her emotionally, protecting her against people who would be unkind to her. He ought to try to protect her from depleting herself physically. Men, again, this is in general, men have a lot more energy than women. So a man and woman can do the same thing all day. She'll be twice as tired as he'll be at night. It's just a fact. So he needs to protect her in every way he can. Here's the fourth thing. The fourth responsibility is the husband is to honor his wife. He's to honor her. Chapter 3, verse 7 says, and show her honor. To honor someone is to value that person. So there's a lot of things, what's something worth? Well, in our world, it's whatever anybody will pay for it, right? Like I've never gotten the baseball card thing. We used to have all kinds of baseball cards when we were kids. Every time you got a penny, you'd go to the store and buy one and have a piece of gum in it. If you got a nickel or dime, you'd buy a bigger pack with more cards in it, all that stuff. But now there's cards worth probably tens of thousands of dollars. I don't get it. But if somebody will pay that, it's worth it. I don't get you get pieces of art, especially these abstract pieces of art. And somebody will give $1 million for it. Now I think he didn't even get the eyeball in the right place. But if somebody will pay that, it's worth it. So what those things don't have a value of their own. Somebody decides how valuable they are. Make sense? Somebody sets the value. What's the same thing with your spouse? You honor her, you value her. You set the value for her. To honor someone is to serve them. When you honor someone, what you're saying is you're worth my attention and effort. Look at Romans 12:10. Give preference to one another in honor. To give preference to someone is to let them have their way. Probably all of us know somebody who's always trying to get their way. They might be sneaky about it. They might be manipulative. But when it's all said and done, they're trying to work things out to get what they want the way they want it. This is just the opposite of that. This says, you know what? How would you like to do this? Let's do it that way. Where do you want to go? That's where we'll go. What do you want to have to eat? That's what we'll have to eat. So I go through this game every day of our life. I really do. What do you want to do? What would you like to do? What would you want? Look at Philippians 2, 3, and 4. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourself. Do not look out merely for your own interests, but also for the interests, or personal interests, but also for the interests of others. In a great marriage, the spouses treat their mate as the most important person in the marriage. So if I came up to a couple and I said, which one of you is the most important person in the marriage? They would point to each other. He would say, she is. She would say, he is. They would say, your happiness is as important or more important than mine. We'll reach a decision if we differ, and you will. And by the way, I do a message on this sometime. There's so many different skills to personal maturity. Here's one of them. Personal maturity says we can come to an impasse, not reach a conclusion that we're both happy with, and still go on. That's maturity. That's a skill. See, that other couples would fight to the death till one of them won. And when one of them won, the two of them lose. In a marriage, if you win, the marriage loses. So you want to make sure you lose and the marriage wins. So what you try to do is find something we can both agree on and we're both happy with. But if we're not, we're doing it your way. No, we're not. We're doing it your way. No, we're not. We're doing it your way. So you can run around that pole as many times as you want to. I'm happy with that pole. That's what love does. That's how love acts. I will not win at your expense. It just won't happen. Thinking you're always right is conceit, not humility. It's also selfishness. Thinking you should always get your way is selfish and conceited. It's not humble. Thinking that your husband or wife is less than, not as smart as you, is conceit, not humility. Thinking that your mate should primarily serve you rather than you primarily serving him or her is selfish and conceited, not humility, looking after the interests of others. Treating your mate as if he or she is a child and you are the adult in the relationship is conceit, not humility. Listen closely. If you always have to get your way and always be right, there's something badly broken in you that needs to get fixed, die, or both. It makes you a user, and you're really incapable of loving someone well because you've got to have your way. And you can think, I've got to have my way because I have high standards. That's not it. Almost never is that it. You've got to have your way because you're broken and you're proud and you're stubborn rather than being flexible and humble. The more you don't have to get your way, the more you don't have to be right, the more your marriage is about what you deserve or not about what you deserve, the more like Christ you are. So the more like Christ I am, I don't have to get my way. I don't have to be right. And I won't go around talking about what I, quote, deserve. When I'm doing those things, I'm being unlike Christ. It goes on to say in Philippians 2:5, have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus. What attitude's that? It's doing nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind regarding one another is more important than yourself. It's not looking out for your own interests merely, but also for the personal interests of others. And you can go to the bank on this. The couple where both people are flexible and don't have to get their way and be right is the happy couple. The couple that is flexible and don't have to get their way and don't have to be right is the happy couple. And the couple where somebody has to be right, has to get their way, somebody's not happy in that marriage. Count on it. The more flexible you are, the happier you're going to be. The more you have to have everything the way you want it, the less happy you're going to be. You heard me say it this way before. The more you require to be happy, the less happy you'll be. If you don't require a lot to be happy, you'll be happy all the time. Because you get all this great stuff happening. But if your expectation, your demand to be happy is up here, as they say it's an 8 on a scale of 1 to 10, you can be getting 8.9s and you're unhappy. If your expectation was a 3, you'd be getting, 5.9 in the plus side. You'd be thrilled. Same exact thing, just different attitudes about it. Here's the 5th one. He is to consult her. Consult her. In 1 Peter 3:7, it says he's to honor her, and then says, as a fellow heir of the grace of life. If your wife is a believer, she is a fellow heir of the grace of life. So what's that mean? That means she's an equal. She's not a less than. Galatians 3:28 says there's neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither slave nor free man, there's neither male nor female, for you're all one in Christ Jesus. In Genesis 1:27, it says, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. Together, The man and woman reflect the image of God. By himself, he does not. It's an inadequate reflection. By herself, she does not. It's an inadequate reflection. The two of them together do. I've done a message for what I call the soft side of God. And it talks about all these things like God wiping the tears away. It's God's love. It's His compassion. It's His mercy. It's His forgiveness. That's the soft side of God. And that's typically reflected in the woman. Then there's the what we might call the hard side of God. His righteousness, His judgment, His wrath. And more often than not, that's reflected in the husband. Now, in a home, that can be different. We got a couple in the church. They met working at a hospital together. I won't name them. Some of you might recognize the story. They were working in a hospital together, and all the other nurses were saying, you ought to be dating her, and she ought to be dating you. And so they're trying to set them up. And so one day, they had this drug addict they brought in to the hospital, and the guy was trying to restrain her. I think it was a her. He was trying to settle her down, restrain her. She was just out of her mind. And so she just spits right in his face. And this other lady who goes to our church decked her, punched her right in the face. Now, she probably can't do that today. She'd go to jail, but she did then. And he said, that's when I knew she was the one for me. This is a big guy, but he's at his house. You hear this all the time. You wait till your mother gets home. So most times it's you wait till your father gets home. Anyway, she's tough. But together they reflect God's image. Look at 1 Corinthians 7, 3 and 4. The husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. That's talking about sexual responsibility in a marriage. You can go back to verses 2 and 1 and see that. Verse 4 is what I want you to see. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise also the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Think about that. What are the implications of that if you believe it? Well, one thing is pretty clear, is they're equals. The husband doesn't have all the authority in the relationship. He has authority over her body, she over his. Say, well, what's that look like in the real world? I think it kind of looks like this. You're a man. You can wear your hair short, long. You can have a beard, a mustache, or neither. What should you do? Well, I want to do this. That should not be the question. The question ought to be, what does your wife want you to do? She wants your hair short, you cut it short. She wants you with a beard, you grow a beard if you can. If it's an ugly one like I'd grow, she'd say cut it off. If you want to, she wants you to have longer hair, have longer hair. Why wouldn't you do this? Isn't loving somebody, find out what they want and try and do it for them? And she has authority over your body, not you. That's not your decision. And what about her? How should she look and dress? And on and on and on. A lot of people get tattoos this day. Say, I want a tattoo. Well, you should never get one. Especially if your spouse would say, yeah, I don't want you to have one. If she'd say that, it's over. If you're going to have a Christian marriage. Now, you can have a kind of Christian marriage, and then you can pick and choose which parts of the Bible you want to apply to your life. But if you have a Christian marriage, she decides what you do, not you. And you decide what she does, not her. And if two people do that with the right attitude, it turns out really good, really good. A part of living with his wife in an understanding way is listening to what she has to say. And watch this. I told you a shocker last week. Remember last week I told you, ladies, sometimes it's hard to believe, but your husband can be right. Probably just once a decade, but he can be right. Now here's the thing, men. Sometimes your wife is right. And sometimes you think you're wrong, and you can argue why you think she's wrong, and you can argue why you think she's wrong, and she's still right. And she can't defend why she thinks the way she thinks, feels the way she feels. But she's still right. You tracking with me? In the Garden of Eden, Adam listened to Eve. He should not have. He listened, took the fruit. In Genesis 16:2, Abraham listened to Sarah about Hagar. He should not have. But then you come to Genesis 21:12, and God tells Abraham to listen to his wife and do what she says. Men tend to use logic to make decisions. Women are often more intuitive. Ladies, listen up. This is for you. Your intuition is not infallible. It's just not. Men, listen up. Her intuition is not always wrong. Sometimes it's dead right. She can't defend it. You can bring an argument to tear it down, but she's right. She can't explain why, but she's right. A great example of this in the Bible. Pilate blew off his wife's dream, which is a bit like intuition. You know, she comes and says, I had this bad dream about this man, have nothing to do with him. Oh, you silly woman. That's not scientific. That's not logical. That's not reasonable. And so what did he do? He went ahead and had Jesus crucified and secured him a place in hell. Look at Matthew 27:19. While Pilate was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent him a message saying, have nothing to do with this righteous man, for last night I suffered greatly in a dream because of him. And so what did he do? He blew her off. Especially listen to your wife if she thinks some lady is flirting with you. When a woman flirts with a man, he doesn't see it because it feels good. And by the way, ladies, flirt with your man so much that nobody else can do it. You know, so if some girl comes up and says, I think you're really cute, so does my wife. I think you're really funny, so does my wife. And vice versa. Boy, you're really pretty. Boy, my husband tells me that all the time. You're really smart. Oh, I know. My husband just tells me that all the time. But you know what? She never hears that. If he never hears that, it feels really good. And a lot of men will get flirted with, but a woman can smell it from a mile away, and he's oblivious to it. If she says, that girl is coming on to you, she's coming on to you. Put some distance between you and her, and vice versa. If a guy feels that way, even if he's wrong, shouldn't you honor him? And shouldn't you honor her, even if they're wrong? Shouldn't you honor that? You know, I don't think they're flirting with me, but you know what? If you feel that way, it's not okay. So I'm going to put distance between me and her or him, whatever it might have been. If you married a smart girl, you know, talking about, you know, consulting with your wife. If you married a smart girl, that makes you smart, right? And if you think she isn't smart, what does that make you? So if you married some real sharp, smart girl who can really get things done, don't be intimidated. Just strut a little bit. I'm a smart man. Marry a guy like this. Here's a verse I want you to see in a new light. 1 Corinthians 11:9. Man was not created for the woman's sake, but the woman for the man's sake. Now, some people would look at that and say what that means is women were created to serve men. I don't think that's what it means at all. It's a wrong interpretation. Think of it this way. The woman is created, why? For the man's sake. What's that mean? He needed her. He needed her. And when he got her, God said it's very good. And when he didn't have her, God said it wasn't good. He needed her. That's what that means. It doesn't mean she was made to serve his whims. It means that he needed her. So just kind of flesh this out. And by the way, men probably need women far more than most women need men. They just do. They just do. I don't think a husband should ever make a major decision without his wife's agreement. Ever. It's about money. She doesn't know much about that. Ever. I remember reading it. I don't know if it was Dave Ramsey or Ron Blube, about his money books about handling money, and how a wife's intuition, she had a bad feeling about some deal. She had no reason to feel that way. She had no explanation for it, and she was right. And he blew her off because she couldn't explain it, got into a bad deal, lost a bunch of money. That can happen all the time. So you don't make a major decision without her agreeing with you. You know, I've seen people pick up their wives and move. When I went to Mid-America Seminary in Memphis, after I finished the UT, Betsy and I had been married for a year. She'd graduated from nursing school. I was going to start seminary. I could have gone to New Orleans. That was a pretty good option. I could have gone to Southwestern, which is in Fort Worth, Texas. That was a pretty good option. Mid-America was an option. How did I decide? Betsy had a friend in Memphis. Her husband was in medical school or dental school there. That's how I decided. I thought about her. Rather than dragging her to Texas or Louisiana or someplace else where she'd know nobody, I thought about that. So if you're thinking about, and guys, listen to me. There's a couple of things, you guys. Every decision you make ought to be the best decision for your family. Should never just be the best decision for you. Well, it's a great opportunity. I'll make a lot more money. That's a selfish, conceited, not being the head of your family position. What you ought to say, I'm going to make the decisions best for my family. And there's a lot more money there. Even though that'll help me get up that ladder in the corporation there, it won't be good for my children, or it won't be where my wife wants to be, so no thank you. I've said this in the past. Until you've turned down a bunch of money so you could do the right thing, you're not a real man in the business place. You don't just do what pays you the most. What pays you the most may occupy so much of the time you don't have any time to do what God made you for. One of the reasons that the men, I'm on a roll here, so just let me roll, okay? One of the reasons men make so much more money in all these tests, when they do these studies, is because they're CEOs of all these companies. Why are they CEOs of all these companies? It's because corporations are prejudiced against women. It has nothing to do with it. Most of those men are working 80 hours a week. How many mothers want to do that? Almost none. Almost none. And so women aren't willing to pay that kind of price and live that kind of life. I'm glad they're not. And so they don't go to those positions, so they don't make the kind of money those men do. But there are women who do that, and men and women who are in the same positions. This may surprise you, but this is a fact. Men and women who are in the same positions, the women make more money than the men. You can go look that up, Thomas Sewell. But you always do what's best for the other. Just always, always. A fantastic way to give your opinion in a marriage is just this. It ought to be this way all the time. I may be wrong, but here's what I think. I may be wrong, but here's what I feel. Because you know why you ought to say it that way? Because you might be wrong. It happens. You need to write in your notes somewhere, I might be wrong sometimes. And then right past it, I am wrong sometimes. We all are. So we get off our high horse. But see, that goes back to that brokenness inside of us where we have to be right. And we get in our own way all over the place. You may be wrong. Most of us are a lot more than we think we are. Husbands fulfill his responsibility to his wife. That includes, but is not limited to, serving her, understanding her, protecting her, honoring her, consulting with her. And then, number two, a husband's responsibility to his wife is his responsibility to God. It's really his responsibility to God. A Christian husband or wife is to love their mate because it's what God wants them to do, not just because the mate is earning it. So when I'm loving Betsy, I'm obeying Jesus. And if I'm not loving her, I'm not obeying him. This makes sense? It's my responsibility to him. And same way, her to him. It's the same thing. She's to be respectful to her husband. Why? Because it's what God says she's to do. Look at Ephesians 5:22, 4, and 5. Wives, be subject to your own husbands as to the Lord. That's who you're doing it for. Verse 24, as the church is subject to Christ, so also wives ought to be their husbands in everything. They're doing it for him. 25, husbands, love your wives just as Christ also loved the church, gave himself up for her. So why is he supposed to love her? It's his duty to God. It's his responsibility to God. We love God by loving who he loves. When you've done it to the least of these, you've done it to me. You love God, go love somebody he loves, and God will feel real loved. I'll say this twice. Loving each other well is not just how we love each other, it's how we love God. Loving each other well is not just how we love each other, it's how we love God. Now, if you've got children, if you've got married children like I do, and they're married to 2 good men now, and it's a joy to me to be around my son-in-laws and see how good they are to my daughters. Don't you know that makes me feel good? Well, how's it make God feel when I'm good to his daughter, Betsy? And if she's loving me well, how do you think God feels because she's loving his son well? Big deal. Big deal. Loving my wife well is not just my responsibility to her, it's my responsibility to God. Now, put in your outline one of the most important biblical principles in relationships. It's one of the most important biblical principles in relationships. I'll say it twice. Being right with God requires us to do all that we can to be right with others. Being right with God requires us to do all that we can to be right with others. Along the same lines of when you love them, you love me, is if you're not right with them, you're not right with me. If I'm not right with Betsy, I'm not right with God. I can't be right with him and not be right with her. Jesus makes this crystal clear. Look at Matthew 5:23-4. If you're presenting your offering at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go your way. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and present your offering. So what's that mean? God says, before you bring me your worship, your offering, go get right with the person you're wrong with. We should do everything we can to be in right relationship with others. In the book of Ephesians, it says, don't let the sun go down on your anger, which some people think that means stay up till you fix this. That's probably not a good idea. But the bottom line is, you make things right. I can't be not right with somebody, I'll have a condition that in a moment, and be right with God. In bad marriages, individuals want and need to be right. In great marriages, couples care more about the other person and the relationship than they do about being right. I talked briefly Sunday morning about winning the battle and losing the wars. Happens a lot. The good news is you're right. The bad news is she's leaving. You showed him, didn't you? You showed her, didn't you? I love the Bible's balance. So look at Romans 12:18. If possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. So sometimes you can't be right with somebody because they're not willing to be right with you. Has that happened to anybody besides me? That's going to happen. So what do? Well, you do what you can to be right with that person. And if they don't want to be right with you, it's over. You're no longer responsible for that. But you ought to do everything you can to be right with that person, be at peace with all men. A right relationship requires both people to want it to be right. So sometimes you got somebody who wants it to be right, somebody else who's just going to be mad and stubborn and punish. You can't fix that. If you want to be right vertically with God, you got to be right horizontally with people, especially your spouse. Husbands are told to serve their wives, live with their wives in an understanding way, protect their wives since they're physically weaker, honor and treat their wives as equals. And then he tells us why in 1 Peter chapter 3 at the end of that verse 7, so that your prayers will not be hindered. So that your prayers will not be hindered. Your relationship with God isn't right if your relationship with your spouse is wrong. That's what he's saying. If you're married, you can't be a good Christian but a bad husband or wife. If you're a bad husband or wife, you're not a good Christian. Marriage is to be an earthly picture of our relationship with God. In the Old Testament, it was that way. God was married to Israel. And when Israel was unfaithful to him, he called them, Hosea 7:4, adulterers. And then actually in Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 8, it says, God sent them away and divorced them. You don't think about God being a divorcee, do you? In the New Testament, Jesus is the bridegroom and the church is the bride. Being a good husband or a wife, watch this, is a choice. The best marriages are not those with the best looking people. I could give you examples. Hollywood. Get all these, quote, beautiful people get married. And then they marry somebody else and somebody else and somebody else and somebody else. Well, shouldn't they be happy? They're both beautiful. J-Lo, Jennifer Lopez. You know, who in the world would ever want to be with her? She's a man-eater. It just goes from one man to another, to another, to another, to another, to another. Is there a man in hospital in Hollywood hadn't slept with her? I don't know. And the list could go on and on. You don't have a great marriage because you're both good looking. The best marriages are not those with the highest levels of education. You can have 2 PhDs and have a horrible marriage. You can be 2 medical doctors, have a horrible marriage. The best marriages are not those who share the same hobbies. Betsy and I don't hardly share anything. She skates, rides a bike, I play tennis and golf. That's not a problem. We go on trips, what's she do? We find her a bicycle. And she rides. Typically, I'm studying on trips, but anyway, it's fine. It works. The best marriages are not those with the most money. If so, all the rich people and Hollywood people have the best marriages. But they don't, do they? The best marriages are where 2 people choose to love each other well. They find out what the other person likes, and they choose to do it a lot. They find out what the other person doesn't like. Remember, they're studying them. They're learning them. Living in an understanding way. And when they find out what they don't like, they quit doing it. In the best marriages, couples live with each other in an understanding way, recognizing and appreciating the differences between them, rather than her trying to turn him into her and him trying to turn her into him. She needs to say, you know, you're suitable for me. You're my opposite. How many of y'all in your marriage, probably this is true, most of us, you got a spender and a saver. You got a morning person and a night person. You got somebody who's always hot and somebody who's always cold. And the list could go on and on and on. Opposites, just like God intended. But what you want them to become you, and they want you to become them. You're not supposed to be. If you're just alike and see everything eye to eye, one of you is redundant. One of you is unnecessary. In my family, God doesn't just give me his point of view. He gives us his point of view. And sometimes he gives it to her. Make sense? We're put together. In the best marriages, couples treat each other as God's children and fellow heirs of the grace of life. They show respect, give preference to, and honor one another. Their names, as we talked about last week, are safe in their spouse's mouth. They consider the other person's needs and wants to be at least, if not more important than their own. They look out for their mate's interests. You should think more about what your mate wants than you think about what you want. The things that make marriages great are the choices that the people in them make. Real simple. Every couple is reaping what they've sown. You got a great marriage, you've been sowing great stuff. You got an okay marriage, you've been sowing okay stuff. If you're in trouble, you've been sowing bad stuff. No 2 people just happen to have a good marriage, and no 2 people just happen not to. Our marriages get better when we do. If we're honest, don't we have to admit that the problem in a marriage is not knowing what to do as much as it is doing what we know? I'll say that again. If we're honest, which we usually aren't, the problem in a marriage is not knowing what I ought to do. It's doing what I know I ought to do. I just don't do it. I've said this before, successful people can almost always tell you why they're successful. So anytime you meet somebody who's successful, the first thing you want to do is say, can I have a bit of your time? Ask them why they're successful. It may be spiritually, it may be financially, it may be relationally, it may be maritally, it may be as a parent. You ought to ask them why they're successful. I promise they can tell you. Let me think about it a little bit, but they can tell you. It's no accident. They can just fall off a turnip truck and have a great marriage. They didn't do that. Tell me what you did right. If you had to do over again, tell me what you would do differently and why. Knowing what you know now, how would you do this? What would be your best advice for me? Learn from them. On the other hand, unsuccessful people hardly ever can tell you why they're unsuccessful. They're just not lucky like somebody else. People say Larry Bird was lucky. Larry Bird said, the more I practice, the luckier I get. It's the truth. Think about this. The better we become at being Christian, the better our marriages will be. If I was like Christ and my wife was like Christ, don't you think we'd have a pretty good thing going? Have that kind of integrity, that kind of love, that kind of compassion, mercy, faith, patience, and the list goes on and on and on. We'd have a pretty good marriage, wouldn't we? The more unlike Christ we are, the more difficult our marriages will be. So if you want a better marriage, what do you need to do? You need to become a better, more like Christ Christian.